Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, srce Tita, rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srce Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode,
Greetings everybody and welcome along. It is the evening of the 3rd of July 2024 and you join us for part 5 of the ongoing series covering the work of Joseph Stalin in the collected works edition, or I should say selected works edition, known as On the Opposition, whereby we are going through all of the contributions by Stalin in the 1920s in the inner party debates against the various different configurations of the opposition, led by principally Trotsky, but also at various different points, including Kamenev, Zinoviev, Radek, Preobrazhensky, and many others. And tonight we are looking at a somewhat famous text in this particular collection, in that we are looking at something entitled Trotskyism or Leninism, which is comes from a speech delivered by Stalin in the year of Lenin's death, so on later in November 1924, with Lenin having been dead at the beginning of the year. You can see the dividing lines ever get drawn between Trotsky and the majority of the Bolshevik Party. So what we're going to be doing tonight is discussing this text, and then we'll be looking at the key themes to discuss and taking questions, etc. But before we begin, given that much that we are about to talk about will be seen by some as mere historical detail, it's important to draw out why we're studying this and why the studying of these differences all the way back in the 1920s, 100 years ago now, still matter to this day. And to do this, I'm going to read to you a quote from Engels, which is taken from Engels' work Anti-Düring, one of his classic texts where he defends scientific socialism against a German professor by the name of Eugen Düring, who later went on to become a rabid anti-Semite and German petty bourgeois nationalist. So there you go. Now, this is on page 30, the quote I'm about to read to you, of this edition of Anti-Düring, although because this is from the introduction, this text is also present, I think, in the shortened version, the pamphlet version of this book, entitled Socialism, Utopian or Scientific. So, quote reads as follows. It's quite extensive, but I want to read it all to you, and then I'll explain my reasons for doing so in just a moment. Quote reads as follows. Every organic being is every moment the same and not the same. Every moment it assimilates matter, supplied from without, and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die, and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed, and is replaced by other molecules of matter, so that every organic being is always itself, and yet something other than itself. Further, we find upon closer investigation that the two poles of an antithesis, positive and negative, e.g., are as inseparable as they are opposed, and that, despite all their opposition, they mutually interpenetrate. And we find in like manner that cause and effect are conceptions which only hold good in their application to individual cases, but as soon as we consider the individual cases in their general connection with the universe as a whole, they run into each other, and they become confounded when we contemplate that universal action and reaction in which causes and effects are eventually eternally changing places, so that what is effect here and now will be cause there then, and vice versa. None of these processes and modes of thought enters into the framework of metaphysical reasoning. Dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things and their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. Such processes as those mentioned above are therefore so many corroborations of its own method of procedure. Nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasing daily, and thus has shown that in the last resort nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. Now, I read that quote to you to give a bit of foregrounding to the discussion that we are about to have, because what Engels is saying there, the concept that Engels is advancing and defending, is that the process of scientific socialism, the method of analysis, the methods of scientific socialism, are important because, of course, they are true, and nature bears that out, but also that if you are a scientific socialist, you must consider all questions in the whole, i.e. taking full account of all the different interconnections of a particular problem. And that if any of your presumptions, any of the building blocks of your analysis are faulty, are not up to the task, or that the assumptions upon which you have built your analysis are fundamentally flawed, then you are going to get an incorrect outcome. You are going to get an outcome which is not accurate. Your experiment is going to fail. Or if we are in the real world and we're talking about the applications of scientific socialism to revolution, then the revolution is going to fail. And what Stalin is advancing in this short speech that he delivered, but I think an important one, is that he is defending the same concepts there as Engels, in that he, by opposing Trotsky, he is arguing that Trotsky has been guilty of abstracting various different segments of the whole of the question of revolution and counter-revolution, of defending a revolution, in order to pursue opportunistic conclusions, and that Trotsky's abstractions are and can only lead to bad results, because he has essentially ignored the lessons taught by Lenin, which Stalin will go through, and is pursuing an opportunistic and individualistic line, which will not lead the proletariat to a successful revolution, but will in fact lead it to disaster, because there is a fundamental flaw in the very foundations of Trotsky's reasoning when it comes to the most important questions. And that's being generous and saying that there is here in this disagreement a genuine disagreement on Trotsky's part, and not just opportunism or something even shadier than that, which we will get into later, I'm sure. So this is Stalin, as he often does, defending what has become known as the Marxist-Leninist method. In doing so, he is defending the scientific socialist method of analysis. He's defending dialectical materialism against Trotsky's opportunism, petty bourgeois individualism, and idealism. So with that in mind, we will begin. And as always, I'm going to go through my remarks first and take questions afterwards. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour to 40 minutes or so. So this is a speech delivered in November of 1924. Again, this is now 10 months after the death of Lenin in early 1924. You will remember that in the last episode we did on this, we were talking about the results of the 13th Congress, the Lenin intake into the Bolshevik Party, which vastly increased the numbers of workers who were in the Bolshevik Party, and the growing dividing lines between Trotsky and the majority of the Bolshevik Party, who are represented by Stalin simply because Stalin is the general secretary at the time. So it is his job as general secretary of the party to deliver responses to things. And this is the question of individuals will come up later on in this particular leaflet as it became. So the opening of this discussion is about the October Revolution, specifically because in this time, mid to late 1924, Trotsky is, often via others, having a series of articles and pamphlets written about the October Revolution and his role in it. The purpose of which is to promote his role in it, over-promote his role in it, relegate the role of almost everybody else, and then put himself on a par with Lenin, which is what he kept trying to do. It's what the Trotskyists to this day try to do, with the aim basically of, as Stalin says, substituting Trotskyism for Leninism. So, first of all, Stalin mentions a couple of interesting things. He mentions that Trotsky is obviously trying to talk up his role in the revolution. He's trying to portray the Bolshevik Party as hopelessly divided on the eve of the revolution, with only Trotsky and, of course, he always says himself alongside Lenin, seeing the truth and the need for the uprising. And Stalin says that this is basically a load of all crap. He says that there were divisions over whether an uprising should be staged in October of 1917, and that Zinoviev, Kamenev, and a few others were actually opposed to it. But Stalin says once the vote of the Central Committee had been taken, Zinoviev and Kamenev accepted the vote and worked towards the fulfillment of the objective. Whereas Trotsky's digging this up in 1924 specifically in order to talk himself up as the only man next to Lenin who possibly understood things at the time. Because, of course, Lenin's reputation by this stage is so big, and justifiably so, that Trotsky can't possibly attack Lenin in the manner that he used to prior to 1917. So he's doing the opposite. Trotsky is positioning himself next to Lenin as Lenin's most loyal defender. And if you're at all familiar, if you've listened to this show for a while, you might be well versed in our discussions of the revisionists, Khrushchev and especially Gorbachev, and you'll be familiar with the way in which the revisionists conducted themselves. Here we will draw upon the work of another Zinoviev, Alexander Zinoviev, who was an advisor to Gorbachev in the 80s, who said quite openly that their aim of promoting Lenin was to destroy Stalin. And then, but they don't promote the real Lenin, they promote a distorted version of Lenin. And then we would promote, as he says, promote Plekhanov to destroy Lenin, then promote Marx to destroy Plekhanov, then destroy Marx. And so what Trotsky's doing in this, by building up a false representation of Lenin and having himself be right next to it, Trotsky's using some of the same methods that would be used later by Khrushchev and by Gorbachev, in that they all promote like a false version of Lenin, which is a version of Lenin who agrees with them. They put themselves right next to this false version of Lenin, drawing upon the enormous credibility and the enormous prestige that Lenin's name rightly carries. So they create the false version of Lenin and Leninism. They then declare that they, either Khrushchev or Trotsky originally or Gorbachev later, are the true representation of this true legacy of Lenin, which they've created out of whole cloth and made up, and that therefore the evil Stalin must be destroyed, or the party must be destroyed, as Gorbachev would go on to argue. And this is part of what Stalin is writing about here. So Stalin contests Trotsky's view of the preparations for the revolution, and he says that Trotsky is essentially trying to write himself a bigger reputation in his work. Now, Stalin doesn't try to downplay Trotsky's role in the revolution. He does try to, and does successfully state, that Trotsky's role within that again needs to be contextualized. He says, "I must say, however, that Trotsky did not play any special role in the October uprising, nor could he do so. Being chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, he merely carried out the will of the appropriate party bodies, which directed every step that Trotsky took. To Philistines like Sukhanov, all this may seem strange, but the facts, the true facts, wholly and fully confirm what I say." So what he's talking about there is like Trotsky, if you read his work, if you read, I did years ago, his history of the Russian Revolution, he's constantly talking about himself, often, in fact, almost entirely in the third person. Trotsky did this, Trotsky did that, Trotsky did the other. And he doesn't mention that he's acting under instruction from various different bodies within the Bolshevik Party that have essentially mandated him to act a certain way, vote a certain way, push a certain line. And he doesn't mention any of that. It's all his own genius. This is how he writes. And Stalin's point is, no, you became part of the party. You became quite late on a Bolshevik, a member of the Bolshevik Party, and then you were told to carry out certain actions. And he says, yes, Trotsky did carry them out, and quite successfully, but he was still acting under instruction. It wasn't his own genius that came up with this. So we move on to look at some of the other things that Stalin talks about here. Here I'm going to read a bit more about Trotsky's role. So we are on page 110 here, of the work on the opposition. You can find the e-copy of this on the website if you haven't done so already. So this next quote reads as follows. Granted, we are told, but it cannot be denied that Trotsky fought well in the period of October. Yes, that is true. Trotsky did indeed fight well in October. But Trotsky was not the only one who fought well in the period of October. Even people like the left socialist revolutionaries, who then stood side by side with the Bolsheviks, also fought well. In general, it must be said that in the period of a victorious uprising, when the enemy is isolated and the uprising is growing, it is not difficult to fight well. At such moments, even backward people become heroes. The proletarian struggle is not, however, an uninterrupted advance, an unbroken chain of victories. The proletarian struggle also has its trials, its defeats. The genuine revolutionary is not one who displays courage in the period of victorious uprising, but one who, while fighting well during the victorious advance of the revolution, also displays courage when the revolution is in retreat, when the proletariat suffers defeat, who does not lose his head and who does not funk when the revolution suffers reverses, when the enemy achieves success, and who does not become panic-stricken or give way to despair when the revolution is in a period of retreat. And that's a very important point, because with regard to both the evolving nature of the struggle as to who and which organization stands where, but also what the duty of a revolutionary is. As Stalin says, when a revolution is on the up, when the Bolsheviks are storming the Winter Palace and Kerensky is on the run, the provisional government is falling apart in early November of 1917, it's very easy to be a Bolshevik in some respects, to bask in the reflected glory. It's a lot harder to be a Bolshevik in the middle of 1919 or 1920 or early 1921. And those who are true revolutionaries are the ones who fight their best and when the times are at their worst. So it's another case of Stalin basically saying, well, look, easy to be a great revolutionary when things are on the up, but how are you when things are on the down? And as he reminds us, Trotsky violated his mandate when things were more difficult, lost his head, if we're being generous, lost his head in the negotiations over the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and almost caused German imperialism to be able to march all the way to Petrograd as it was then. So again, very easy to be a great revolutionary on the way up, as is the point. And of course, he mentions there the left socialist revolutionaries, who were the allies of the Bolsheviks in that early part of the revolution, who upon the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk then went over into terrorism and attempted insurgency against the Bolsheviks and ultimately completely lost the plot. And the best of them just went straight over into the Bolsheviks' organization. The worst of them collapsed into reactionary behavior and ended up joining the counter-revolution, quite a few of them anyway. So Stalin does go on to mention that. He goes on to also mention that the Trotsky violated his orders at in the period of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and this was an example of like Trotsky losing his head and going into what Stalin describes as a funk when met with a serious challenge. So important to bear in mind that at each stage of the revolution, on the up and on the down, and at every point in between, there's going to be changes in the personnel, prompted by changes in the dynamics, and people who were solid and militant revolutionaries yesterday might collapse into being complete opportunists or even traitors tomorrow. This is particularly true of ultra-lefts, who are often of a petty bourgeois background, like Trotsky, and will descend into the most bitter hatreds if they feel like that they have been thwarted. And again, we come back to one of my favorite sayings of Stalin's, that the ultra-leftist deviation is in reality a rightist one, because that's the nature of ultra-lefts. And the ultra-left, if frustrated, if thwarted, is often an egotist, and therefore will storm out of and try and wreck any organization he or she is a member of if they feel like that their progress that they feel they are entitled to has been stymied somehow. So we move on then to look at the evolution of the party position after after February of 1917. Trotsky is, in his work in 1924, is accusing Stalin and others of lagging behind, of not being with Lenin, that only Trotsky understood what Lenin was working on when it came to the April thesis. And Trotsky actually anticipated the April thesis and may even have written the April thesis's content before Lenin did. This is the kind of things Trotsky used to claim. So what Stalin replies to this, talking about the days immediately after the uprising that got rid of the Tsar. The way in which this is structured is that, of course, we first talk about the policy prior to the April thesis. Now, we did a program on the April thesis a while ago, so go back and watch that if you need a refresher. But prior to the April thesis, which is where Lenin came and reconfigured the policy of the Bolsheviks, the party had a different orientation, which Stalin goes on to describe. The party, its majority, groped its way towards this new orientation. It adopted the policy of pressure on the provisional government through the Soviets on the question of peace, and did not venture to step forward at once from the old slogan of the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry to the new slogan of power to the Soviets. The aim of this halfway policy was to enable the Soviets to discern the actual imperialist nature of the provisional government on the basis of the concrete questions of peace, and in this way to wrest the Soviets from the provisional government. But this was a profoundly mistaken position, for it gave rise to pacifist illusions, brought grist to the mill of defencism, and hindered the revolutionary education of the masses. At that time, I shared this mistaken position with other party comrades and fully abandoned it only in the middle of April, when I associated myself with Lenin's thesis. A new orientation was needed. A new orientation was given to the party by Lenin in his celebrated April thesis. So, what Stalin's talking about there is that prior to Lenin returning, that the party was putting forward demands regarding peace and the ending of the war, but wasn't being clear about what should happen to the provisional government. Lenin steps forward and puts forward in the April thesis that the whole thing needed to be torn down, and the Soviets needed to be the ones where the power resided. And this is, of course, the famous formulation that would go forward in 1917. But of course, as Stalin was saying, they weren't putting that forward until April. Trotsky, of course, claims that he had put that forward as well, but of course he didn't. And what the point that Stalin is making here is that Trotsky claims to have put forward the idea of that he was actually the one that was saying all power to the Soviets even before Lenin did. But that wasn't what Trotsky was actually saying. Trotsky, in his letters, which we remember were sent from New York, from his American exile, to Russia, and so before he left New York, he was writing things like "No Tsar, but a workers' government." And it's here that we go back to the concept of a scientific analysis. And the scientific analysis tells us, with regard to Trotsky's slogans, that, again, as Stalin has argued before, Trotsky was neglecting the role of the peasants and the necessity of a proletarian alliance with the peasants in Russia of 1917. Now, you see that the problem with Trotsky's slogan, a workers' government, reflects Trotsky's anti-peasant bias, which is that he thought it was time to move immediately to a pure dictatorship of the proletariat, basically with the proletariat in the lead and the peasants just taking orders. Whereas Lenin's point and Stalin's point, who followed him, always was that this alliance needed to be maintained. That the proletariat might be in the lead, but it still remains in an alliance with the landless peasants, and that this alliance needed to be secured through the 1920s. And if you just went straight over into a pure workers' dictatorship, and you were essentially doing what Trotsky had been, remember in the first one of these essays by Stalin that we looked at several weeks ago, where Trotsky was the one demanding grain requisition from the countryside at gunpoint, and Stalin was arguing against it. Well, that was Trotsky's view of the peasants, that they were there to do what the workers told them, and that this idea of partnership was not something he was in favor of. So when we're looking at Trotsky's conceptions, he's not arguing for the same as Lenin. He's arguing for a workers' state, whereas Lenin's argument in the April thesis is all power to the Soviets, of course, including peasant Soviets that had started to emerge in the countryside. So Lenin remains in favor, very much so, of building that alliance with the peasantry and maintaining it. Trotsky is in favor of dictating to the peasantry. And you couldn't have won in Russia in 1917, 18, 19, 20 without the alliance with the peasants. If the peasants' allegiance had been lost to the white armies, then there would have been no revolution. There would have been no successful revolution. Trotsky's program would have taken the Bolsheviks in that direction. It would have taken them in the direction of disaster, because it would have meant abandoning the alliance with the peasantry. So Stalin then covers how Lenin changed the policy. We've been through that before, so we don't really need to look at it. But he does have a rather interesting line there where he says, "No wonder it is said that an obliging fool is more dangerous than an enemy." And that goes for a lot of revisionists. A lot of revisionists haven't necessarily been enemy agents, but they've effectively acted like them because they are obliging fools. True of both Khrushchev and Gorbachev, I think. So we go on to look at Stalin writes more about Lenin's style of leadership in comparison to Trotsky, and how Lenin would spend an awful lot of time trying to understand every conceivable problem that could arise in a given situation. And that this is something that he insisted on doing even when he was in exile, I believe over the border in Finland, or the state border in Finland, after the July days in 1917. And so Stalin makes the point that Lenin would often try and conjure up all the possible errors that could occur, and would even start writing essays about this to the Central Committee even before any of these errors had occurred, because he's basically spending all of his time going over and over again all of their plans, looking at every possible angle that could go wrong and trying to reply to it before it happens. So it's an interesting point to make, and that Lenin would sometimes quite literally make a mountain out of a molehill, just to draw our attention to the molehill, just to draw attention to a small problem. Lenin is always compelling his comrades to come face to face with contradictions, face to face with problems, and forcing them to, as best he can, to work these contradictions out before they come up in the real world. And it's interesting that Stalin highlights that. So moving to the other elements here I wanted to highlight. So we've spoken here about the concept of the obliging fool and Lenin's leadership style. So Stalin goes on to talk about the evolution of the revolutionary process, and he goes through each element of the revolutionary process, from the beginning of the organization of the uprising to its execution. And what he talks about here is worth quoting in full. So, quote reads as follows. This is page 123. The characteristic feature of this period is the rapid growth of the crisis, the utter consternation reigning among the ruling circles, the isolation of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, and the mass flight of the vacillating elements to the side of the Bolsheviks. A peculiar feature of the tactics of the revolution in this period must be noted, namely that the revolution strove in to take every or nearly every step in its attack in the guise of defense. Now, what he's talking about here is when it comes to things like defeating the Kornilov Rising in September of 1917. What they did then, the Bolsheviks, was in the guise of defense of the revolution, they mobilized thousands and thousands of workers to go out and confront Kornilov's army and make revolutionary appeals to the soldiers, which works. The soldiers all melt away, and Kornilov's left as a general without an army in front of Petrograd. So this was defense of the revolution, but defense turned into an assault, because what did it do? It vastly increased the authority of the Bolsheviks amongst the working class. It vastly increased their authority because they were seen to be the ones, correctly seen to be the ones, actually leading a fight against the reaction. Whereas the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries clung to the provisional government and started bleating about unconstitutional behavior. The Bolsheviks, temporarily at least, saved Kerensky from a reactionary overthrow, but they weren't doing it for Kerensky. They were doing it to demonstrate the dangers of reaction. So they took a defensive move that ends up becoming an offensive move, because what it does is it vastly increases the support for the Bolsheviks and vastly increases the support for the idea that only by all power going to the Soviets can the revolution possibly be defended. It strips the authority away from the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries and the Trudoviks and Kerensky himself, because it's shown that only the militant working class under the direction of the Bolshevik Party can hope to defend even the gains of the February Revolution. Like the SRs and the Mensheviks aren't capable of defending it, just because they've tail-ended the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie desperately wants to bring the revolution to a close. So again, what starts out as a defensive measure to defend the revolution becomes an offensive measure because of the way it's carried through. It leaves the Bolsheviks in a much, much stronger position as compared to the Mensheviks, the SRs, and the other defenders, supposed defenders of the provisional government. So I thought that was an interesting thing to reflect upon, how one thing can turn into another. Going back to the very beginning, the idea about everything being constantly in motion. What can start out as a very defensive measure ends up being a measure that goes over to the offense side. So, for instance, if you're in a revolutionary situation, or you're in maybe not in a revolutionary situation, a pre-revolutionary situation where a lot of chaos reigns. Let's assume that's going to happen here sooner or later, or in France perhaps soon, or in the United States. And you're a small organization with some roots in certain working class areas, and that there is a tense situation. There's a lot of labor rebellions. And these rebellions, these strikes, these demonstrations come under attack by fascist elements, lumpenized elements, mobs hired by various different capitalists or manipulated by the various secret services of the bourgeois state. Let's assume that that's going on. So a communist party issues a call to the working class to form defensive detachments. So form bands of trained people who are proficient at a certain amount of self-defense to defend picket lines and demonstrations from reactionary lumpenized mobs who have been attacking them. And so that's a defensive measure. You defend yourself against lumpenized mobs. However, it's also an offensive measure. It's an offensive measure because what you're doing is you're now effectively getting the working class to embrace the idea that you're not making appeals to the state and the state forces in order to keep you safe anymore on a demonstration or on a picket line. You've effectively brought the idea to the class that now it's self-organization. It's an organization of ourselves as a class under the direction of the party. That's how we defend ourselves. Our own organization, ultimately our own organization that might well, in certain circumstances, of course, end up being armed. So what you have done there, you have put forward a defensive measure. We must defend ourselves. We must be organized in defending ourselves. And at the same time, what you have done is you have further undermined and eroded the authority of the bourgeois state. Because by getting the working class to realize the need for self-defense and the need for self-organization, then what you have done is you have undercut any remaining claims of legitimacy that the bourgeois state had with regard to its neutrality. You have got the working class to embrace the idea that it is their own organization that will defend them, their own class-based organization, not the bourgeois state. And so, see, this is what Stalin's talking about. The defensive measure almost automatically becomes an offensive measure, because what you're doing is you're cutting away the authority of the state. You are getting the workers used to this kind of organization, that now you've put the measure forward and it has succeeded and the workers are organizing their own defense. Well, then it's a perfectly natural process to them. It's an easier process of putting forward the next demand, which is that, well, if we're going to defend our own demonstrations and picket lines against roving gangs of lumpen thugs in the employ of the state or otherwise, it's only a short step from that to be able to float the idea to say, well, why can't we organize our own community self-defense anyway? Why is it that armed police forces that are accountable only to the state and the ruling class are needed to supposedly keep us safe, when we can do it with a bit of training and discipline on our own terms? You see, the defensive measure becoming an offensive measure because you're aware of the nature of the state, the bourgeois state versus the working class, the role of the state forces, the acceptance by the working class of the role of the state forces as neutral bodies of public safety, and the undermining of that reputation, and the getting the working class to the point where the working class is prepared to embrace the idea of self-organized defense, community defense, defense of our class, defense of our area. And then once you've reached that point, you are fundamentally undermining the whole idea of the bourgeois state and are putting in its place the idea of the, in our case now, it would be the workers' state, because there is little to no peasantry in Britain. But this would change country by country, obviously. So that's a very important message to take from this. So moving on then to cover a couple of other things from this particular speech of Stalin's. Now, on page 129, he starts to get to the way that Trotsky is misrepresenting things and why. So there's a quote here which I want to read to you in full. It reads as follows. Obviously, there is a different design here, and everything goes to show that this design is that Trotsky, by his literary pronouncements, is making yet another attempt to create the conditions for substituting Trotskyism for Leninism. Trotsky needs desperately to discredit the party and its cadres, who carried through the uprising in order, after discrediting the party, to proceed to discredit Leninism. And it is necessary for him to discredit Leninism in order to drag in Trotskyism as the sole proletarian, don't laugh, ideology. And this, of course, under the flag of Leninism, so that the dragging operation may be performed as painlessly as possible. So remember what I said about Khrushchev and about Gorbachev. Both of these revisionists always carried out their work waving the flag of Lenin, proclaiming themselves to be carrying on Lenin's work against the bad Stalin, and in actual fact undoing and destroying Lenin's work and legacy. And this is the way the revisionists have acted in many socialist countries, but particularly the USSR. So again, worth emphasizing that point. And another point to emphasize is that Trotsky is, of course, again, displaying his wild egomania and trying to substitute himself for Lenin entirely by trying to replace Lenin's actual writings with writings carefully curated by Trotsky. And again, this is something that Trotskyite groups do to this day. They're very careful in terms of what works of Lenin's they reproduce to make sure that they are in line with Trotsky's writings. Because again, they're trying to curate a false image of Lenin to marry it up to their false image of Trotsky. Right. We talked earlier on about the peasantry and the proletariat. So Stalin talks again about it here, but the only thing we need to re-emphasize is that the point about how if one thing's wrong in your formulations, the entire project can run aground, which is what would have happened had Trotsky's line about the peasantry been followed in 1917. There would have been no Soviet Union. They would have lost the allegiance of the peasantry, and without that, the proletarian revolution would most likely have failed. So, moving then to talk about what Trotsky's aiming to do in his work. Now, Stalin makes the claim that what Trotsky's aiming to do is to, by portraying the Bolshevik Party as divided between various different left and right camps before the insurrection of October 1917, by portraying himself as the center of all things, and by now portraying the problems in the party, as we've covered before in previous weeks, as being a contest between youth and the Bolshevik committee men of old, who are out of touch, and it's Trotsky who's of course in touch with the youth and knows what's up. Hello, fellow kids, etc. And so Stalin accuses, quite correctly, Trotsky of trying to discredit the Bolshevik Party and trying to sow distrust in it, which is what he's trying to do. He's constantly promoting himself over and above the party, over and above any other structure or individual within it. It's all about Trotsky himself. So Stalin mentions that Trotsky was happily collaborating prior to October of 1917, prior to his joining the Bolsheviks, I believe in September of 1917, so very much at the last minute, that Trotsky was trying to form a bloc in August with Martov of the Mensheviks and others who were described as the liquidators. So he was trying to form blocs with anti-revolutionary elements right up to the end for reasons that are still rather unclear, and certainly no Trotskyites are going to address them. Was it that Trotsky was just all over the place and that would enter into a bloc with just about anybody who he thought would gain him an advantage by being in a bloc with them? Well, that's certainly possible. Or again, is there something more sinister going on? Or is it a combination of the two? So we move on for Stalin to look again at like the motives of Trotsky. So why is it that Trotsky did some good work in 1917? And Stalin says that the reason why he was able to do some good work is basically he put a political lifetime of scheming and opportunism behind him for a while when he joined the party. And that for a while, he was actually able to and willing to accept direction from the Central Committee and from his new comrades and basically carry out the will of the party successfully, it must be said, within the Petrograd Soviet. So Stalin goes on to say this, and I'll read the full quote again. How could it happen that Trotsky, who carried such a nasty stock-in-trade on his back, found himself, after all, in the ranks of the Bolsheviks during the October movement? It happened because at that time Trotsky abandoned, or actually did not abandon, that stock-in-trade. He hid it in the cupboard. Had he not performed that operation, real cooperation with him would have been impossible. The theory of the August bloc, i.e. the theory of unity with the Mensheviks, had already been shattered and thrown overboard by the revolution. For how could there be any talk about unity when an armed struggle was raging between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks? Trotsky had no alternative but to admit that his theory was useless. So again, Trotsky throws in with the Bolsheviks and for a while acts in a disciplined fashion, but not for too long. It was only as far as up to the point of the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty that he acts in a disciplined fashion. So Stalin goes on to talk about what can be learnt from this. He says, what is the lesson to be learnt from this? Only one, that prolonged collaboration between the Leninists and Trotsky is possible only if the latter completely abandons his old stock-in-trade, only if he completely accepts Leninism. Trotsky writes about the lessons of October, but he forgets that in addition to all the other lessons, there is one more lesson of October, the one that I have just mentioned, which is the prime importance for Trotskyism. Trotskyism ought to learn that lesson of October too. So basically saying that Trotsky can be in this party, regardless of his past, and be a successful part of it. But he has to abandon all of his prior opportunistic and sectarian and hysterical behavior. And of course, he never does. So we move on to talk about the styles of leadership again. And the point that Stalin makes in this work is that Lenin was not only a great Marxist, a visionary leader, but of course, Lenin was very much against the kind of style of work that is embodied by Trotsky. And Trotsky, of course, is prone to ultra-left adventures. He's prone to shooting his mouth off in an ill-disciplined fashion. He's prone to suggesting all kinds of ultra left and then opportunistic ways of working, and get hysterical if he doesn't get his way. And it's the very opposite of the way that Lenin behaved. Lenin always insisted on behavior in a disciplined fashion. He always insisted upon the fact that problems were not to be solved via the act of a genius, but were to be solved via collective discussion, via the collective discussion in the Central Committee, and that this was going to be what produced a more positive result. And Stalin actually quotes extensively from Trotsky's own book with regard to some of the big decisions that had to be made in 1917 and 1918. And he talks about how Trotsky portrays the decision to dismiss, for instance, the Constituent Assembly, how this was portrayed by Trotsky in his book as being a conversation between Lenin and Trotsky and a couple of others. Whereas in actual fact, Stalin makes the point that this is something that was debated out extensively within the Bolshevik Party for quite a number of weeks before the ultimate dissolution, forced dissolution of the Constituent Assembly was made. Before the decision was made, there was weeks of going back and forward and debating in various different positions before a conclusion was reached in those discussions. And that's what Lenin absolutely insisted on. Now, maybe, if we're being charitable, Trotsky's writing this book and he's basically shorthanding all of that to conversations between Lenin and Trotsky and a couple of others. Is he doing that for the purposes of dramatic effect and to tell a good story? Would it be too boring to write about hours and hours of arguments in Central Committee meetings? Or is he doing it to big up his own role? Or is he doing it to deliberately portray things as the actions of as being done by the actions of a few great men? And again, we go back to Trotsky's inversions of Lenin. Lenin always insisted that wherever it was at all practicable, that the big decisions had to be made via this collective discussion, a collective and disciplined discussion. Trotsky, and again, we know this from his own allies, from Isaac Deutscher, from even Ernest Mandel. Trotsky didn't enjoy committee meetings. He hated them and would never act in a disciplined fashion within them. He'd get bored. He'd read a French novel. He'd openly laugh and mock people during these discussions. He wouldn't pay attention. So, again, it's the opposite of Lenin's method of work. Lenin insisted on these debates because, again, he wanted to force out all possible arguments against the position, all possible arguments about it. He wanted to force them out into the open so that they could be dealt with properly, one at a time. And only through doing that will the decision ultimately be made stronger. Remember, this is a collective decision, which it has to be collectively binding over everybody. So it has to be enacted in a disciplined fashion. And people are only going to accept that, or they are more likely to accept that disciplined unity in action if there's been this full and exhaustive debate where all of the potential problems are teased out, discussed, and then the vote is taken and the decision making made. Trotsky always portrays it as Lenin had a chat with somebody and then Lenin decided to do this, because that's the way that Trotsky wants to write about Lenin, because that's the way that Trotsky wants to run things. Yeah, that's the point that Stalin's making here. Again, we come back to this point. Trotsky constructs a false version of Lenin, which is there to essentially be a justification for the way Trotsky wants to run things, and it's the opposite of what Lenin was. Now, I'll read to you the quote here from Stalin. The party knows that Lenin was the greatest Marxist of our times, a profound theoretician and a most experienced revolutionary to whom any trace of Blanquism was alien. And I'll come back to what Blanquism is in just a moment. Trotsky touches upon this aspect too in his book, but the portrait he paints is not of the giant Lenin, but of a dwarf-like Blanquist, who in the October days advised the party to take power by its own hand, independently of and behind the back of the Soviets. I have already said, however, that there is not a scrap of truth in this description. Why did Trotsky need this flagrant inaccuracy? Is this not an attempt to discredit Lenin just a little? So Blanquism if you're not familiar with the term, comes from the name of a 19th century French revolutionary called Louis Auguste Blanqui. Now, Louis Auguste Blanqui was a guy who came out of the French Jacobin tradition. If you read Marx on the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte and the various other books and articles that he wrote at that time covering the class war and the class struggles in France between 1848 to 1851. He talks a little bit about the Blanquists and the traditions in France at the time. Because France has this particular tradition of struggle whereby the Jacobin model persisted for a very long time after its historical usefulness had passed, because it was this great and heroic part of French history, which even French reactionaries today have to pretend to honor in some ways. But if you imagine what it must have been like back in the 1830s, Jacobinism is still a very incredibly powerful historical, and not just a historical memory, but it's a living tradition. Now, Louis Auguste Blanqui, it comes into this picture in the, I believe in the 1830s and 40s onwards. He's born in the very early 19th century. Blanqui was notorious for staging an uprising at the drop of a hat. And he's a very brave man, undoubtedly, a man whose courage can't be doubted. He's quite an intelligent man as well, but he was notorious for literally jumping the gun on everything. Like, strike happens in some remote French village, let's stage an armed uprising. The National Assembly is deadlocked, stage an armed uprising. He's literally his go-to move on every single occasion he could possibly think of to do it. Irony of ironies is that Blanqui, as an older man, missed the Paris Commune almost entirely. I believe it's because he was in prison. But the term Blanquism was an insult that revolutionaries would throw at each other in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to imply that somebody was an adventurist. So Trotsky was, of course, an adventurist and was actually guilty of Blanquism. Lenin was the very last person that you could accuse of that. If you look at all Lenin's work, when he actually wrote a piece on guerrilla warfare, what he's constantly saying is that, and you notice this when you read Lenin never makes a fetish out of any particular form of any particular strategy or tactics, shall we say. He never allows his thought to become ossified in that way. Sometimes he says, well, yes, guerrilla action may be necessary. Again, depends upon where the struggle is. Depends, again, what the link the party has to the masses. What are the masses, what struggle is the other masses prepared to engage in? You need to interrogate this situation before making decisions. Whereas the Blanquist would just say, uprising now, I'm sure we've all met those people in the modern world. So again, as Stalin says, the very last person you could describe as a Blanquist would be Lenin. He was far too meticulous a man for that kind of adventurism. So other things to just say here before we draw things to a close. The aim of Trotsky here, as we've said, is to construct a false version of Lenin that is aligned with Trotsky's ideas, and then inflates Trotsky's reputation by standing him next to this false version of Lenin. And that is the way that Trotsky is proceeding. So that is why Stalin has to issue this speech in response to Trotsky. And again, then the controversy will continue. You'll see next week when we get to a discussion of the tactics of the October Revolution. And there's a reason why Trotsky keeps going back to the October Revolution is because he did have a role within it. He was in an important role, but as Stalin's saying there, yes, an important role, but a role that was only made possible because he was a member of the Bolshevik Party and was carrying out the instructions of the party, not because he was the great big immortal genius who came up with it all on his own, which is what Trotsky routinely argues. So I will now pause for questions. And greetings, in fact. We haven't said hello yet. Hello to Arnold, who is joining us from the land of perfidious Albion. And Arnold is not enjoying the idea of the general election tomorrow. And Arnold, I don't blame you in the slightest. It's grim out there. Just to say that tomorrow will be an election special. We will be beginning our coverage later in the day, so about 10:30. And what I'm going to do is we're going to go through at least to the analysis of the exit polls and the early seats coming in. So it's going to be a bit of an interactive show tomorrow. I hope you can join me for the election special. Then the day after, going to be going through the results, such as they are, to see what the damage is. So please join me for that as well. Grassy Knoll, good day to you. You are joining us from Seattle, Washington. Svetlana joins us from a hot and humid Moscow. And Jawad is with us. Greetings to you, comrade. And Jeremy Turner is with us. Greetings, says Jeremy, from the land of patriots having a hot dog eating contest. Is this the way Biden's choosing to die? He's eating himself into the next world. Gaza Nightmare continues. You're right that the horrors committed by the Israelis continue. But I would always say, and it's important to emphasize this, no matter what barbarities we see the Zionist regime commit, they are losing. They are losing in a war. I remember we've just spent 45 minutes to an hour talking about how Marxists see things in the whole. Okay? And we see the full scope of relations. We interrogate every aspect, all the aspects we possibly can. So when you interrogate all the aspects of the Gaza war, the Israelis are losing. They're losing because in direct contact, in direct fights with Hamas and the other members of the National Liberation Army that exists in Gaza, they're losing. They're losing because their army is becoming demoralized. They're losing because their economy is getting trashed. The port on the Red Sea that's been targeted, Point of Eilat, I think, it's been targeted a lot by Ansar Allah and the Iraqis as well, is going bankrupt because its trade's been cut off. It's been cut off by the Red Sea blockade run by the Yemenis. The Yemenis have won thus far. The great and mighty navies of the United States, Britain and France and Italy have been revealed to be completely impotent. So yes, the nightmare for many Gazans continues, and we should never underplay the horror of that. But we should also say that the heroism that the National Liberation Fighters and their people are representing to us is paying off. The Zionist regime is terminally damaged, and it's on its way to its fall. So we must always bear that in mind, and we must never succumb to despair. Even though if you sit there and you watch dead children crossing your telephone screen for hour upon hour every day, yeah, it's a horror. But we should also emphasize that this is the way imperialism always goes down. It always goes down and creates an absolute tidal wave of blood on its way down. But on its way down it is. And we must continually make that point. Okay. Okay, we also have YepX, who's written something here. YepX says, I have some feedback on the cast review episode. I was hoping that you would go a little more in depth to explain how gender theory serves the bourgeoisie. Well, I'm happy to do so. We can do another episode on that. YepX, please email me to remind me if I get lost in election madness. But your request is a fair one, and we have got sources that can deal with that. Greetings to Jerry and Zuleika and Peter, all three of them coming from Perfidious Albion. Mike Martinez, good afternoon to you. T.G. Wilson, good day to you. Abtin is joining us, as is Gonzalo. Loam Bart says, Stalin, The History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico Lazerdo. A fascinating book to read. Svetlana, in answer to your question, I meant Alexander Zinoviev. Alexander Zinoviev, was a so-called dissident intellectual who was a advisor to Gorbachev in the Perestroika period. And it was him the quote comes from. Yakovlev probably said fairly similar things, but I believe the quote I gave you belongs to Zinoviev. Yakovlev, if you don't know who he is the notorious scumbag who essentially turned the state media of the USSR against communism because he was head of propaganda. Yakovlev is somebody who I do suspect was actually a CIA agent. Again, that's but purely my speculation. But he was in the United States for quite a while, and he was ambassador to Canada for quite a while. So there was ample opportunity for him to be recruited. S.A. Malik joins us at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. I presume you're on the west coast of the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong. Potted Rodent is with us, as is Ivan Kovac, who joins us from Zagreb, Croatia, the once and future socialist Yugoslavia. Eric joins us from the United States. Todd is joining us from New Mexico. Was Trotsky's idea simply to dump the peasants, asked Jeremy? No, Trotsky's idea was, if you take it seriously, that the proletariat, mainly the party, or mainly the military, would basically tell the peasants what to do, order them into doing certain things. Lenin and Stalin both understood that the peasantry, the poor peasants, were a natural ally of the proletariat, but that they had to be brought along one bit at a time. You couldn't just say to them, as Trotsky wanted to do in 1921, give us your fucking grain, or we might shoot you, which is what Trotsky did want to do in 1921. Again, Trotsky's own biographers and sympathetic biographers admit that that was what the line that he wanted to take. So the idea would be that you don't have a partnership with the peasantry, that the workers will tell the peasants what to do. And that is a different relationship, and one that the poor peasantry would not have accepted in 1918, 1920. You wouldn't have been able to fight that civil war if you'd have taken that line. Trotsky was in exile. He went to New York from, I believe it was Spain, on a first-class ticket that was, depending upon which source you believe, either paid for by Parvus or paid for by his very rich uncle, Trotsky's rich uncle. He had two rich uncles, both of whom were very well connected in Tsarist and bourgeois circles. And one of his sources I looked at says that the reason why he got to New York in 1916, I think, was that he had a first-class ticket paid for by either Parvus or his rich uncle. And then I believed he stayed at one of the top-ranked hotels in New York at the time, before moving to an apartment, which again was paid for by donations from other rich people. So Trotsky had a talent for getting hold of money from rich people who will give it to him quite voluntarily. Again, sources as to this time in Trotsky's life vary as to who was giving him the money and why. Was it the rich uncle with connections to the Tsar's inner circle, or was it Parvus and who had connections to people like Basil Zakharov, the notorious arms dealer? Either way, Trotsky always landed on his feet and got some cash in his pocket. And he wasn't a member of the Bolsheviks at the time. He wasn't even really a member of the Mensheviks at the time. He was a guy on his own. I think he was part of I believe they called themselves the Mezrayontsy. If I'm mangling that, I'm sure our Russian speakers in the chat will let me know, which means like the guys in the middle, basically, or the inter-party group. So again, where he got his resources from is a bit strange to examine. Cobra Commander is with us and says, I know about Trotsky's time in Mexico working with the FBI agents for McCarthy. Funnier still, Trotsky was supposed to be at the House Un-American Activities Committee. Trotsky gave testimony to the predecessor of HUAC. It's called the Dies Committee, after the senator that ran it. And he was ratting on communists in Mexico and the US to the FBI. And Trotsky's secretary, a man called Joseph Hansen, there's very strong evidence to suggest that he had been an FBI informant from at least the late 1930s, and that Hoover, the notorious J. Edgar Hoover, was the one who was personally handling Hansen's case. So for J. Edgar Hoover to get directly involved in the handling of an informant's case, handling of an informant's details, well, that's quite something. So Hansen was obviously a very important agent. So Trotsky rats on people to the predecessor of the House Un-American Activities Committee. His secretary at the time is a known FBI asset, and there's FBI agents crawling all over his inner circle in Mexico. So make of that what you will. What are we to make of the fact that the Communist Party in the USSR grew to 4 million members by 1928? How does that sit with Lenin's idea of the party as a committed handful of revolutionaries? It couldn't be a handful anymore, to answer Svetlana's question. You can't run a country with a handful of revolutionaries. The role of the Communist Party changes. Now, it does, as your question indicates, Svetlana, bring challenges to that. And Stalin writes about that extensively. But they needed to grow the party because they needed to have party members overseeing the state apparatus. But also, as importantly, you needed to have party organizations in every part of the Soviet Union, which I don't need to tell you this, but I will tell everybody else, was vast, much vaster than modern day Russia, which is the biggest country on earth. But you needed to have communist organizations, local communist parties in as many places as you could. You needed to have communists in as many places as you could, because how else do you establish and maintain properly the link with the masses unless the Communist Party is moving amongst the masses everywhere and is learning from them, guiding them and being guided by them. So that's why the party grows to 4 million. It's still meant to be the vanguard of the class, though. It's just that now the vanguard of the class is immeasurably bigger because you're responsible for the governing of the country. And again, these problems are still discussed to this day by leaders like Xi Jinping. When you're ruling a country, the Communist Party has to be the best of the class and go from being a handful of professional revolutionaries to being a much larger party to being a nationwide party with potentially millions of members. But certain conditions still have to apply. You still have to train these people to as high a theoretical and practical standard of politics as possible. You still have to train them comprehensively in scientific socialism. As Zyuganov observed recently in an article he wrote for I believe it's an American-Chinese co-produced academic journal. He wrote an article called Into the Future with Lenin. He made an interesting and very correct observation, which is that, well, once you stop ideologically training and educating properly the cadre of the party, then errors and disasters follow shortly afterward, which is what happens. The education of party members stopped being carried out to the same level, probably in the 40s, due to the war and various other things. So that by the time you got to the early 50s, Stalin, before he's death, sees a problem with that and starts trying to train younger cadres and bring them through. But that process wasn't anything like as far on as it should have been by the time of Stalin's death. So Stalin dies and the leadership essentially isn't adequate, unfortunately, because the training and development of new cadres hadn't continued. Those who were at the top were not committed and well-developed Marxist-Leninists, but zigzaggers like Khrushchev or opportunists like Mikoyan, people who might have been, in fact, were good functionaries at various different points, but when called upon to carry out the ultimate responsibility of leading, proved to be poorly educated, opportunistic, and it showed by, again, taking what appeared to be the easy way out in various different scenarios, and then constantly zigzagging back and forth, changing policy overnight. Again, the very opposite of what Lenin did. Remember what we were saying about, and Stalin's point about Lenin getting people together, thoroughly examining the issue, going over it and over it and over it until every angle's been explored, every possible thing that can go wrong has been investigated, every possible point of view interrogated to the point where it either collapses or it gets incorporated into the program. They stopped doing that. And it showed. I mean, there were people who were like that, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet Party had good Leninists all the way up until the end, but not enough of them. And again, this is something that you see that the Chinese party under Xi, his leadership has become became very concerned about that, because China had gone in significant ways. It started to go the same way under the Yang Zemin period and in the Hu Jintao period. And so you see a step into a new period with the Xi leadership, where they are trying very hard to reinvigorate the party as a first step in the next phase of their struggle. I hope that answers your question. Was Trotsky a Menshevik? People have argued that he always was. It's probably a lot less principled than that, though. Shani says, what huge credit gave Bolsheviks to today's Trotskyists by giving opportunity to Trotsky himself to perform during the time of the October Revolution and Civil War? Good point. Almir is right. Leningrad is a much better name. There was no bigger fan of Trotsky than Trotsky, says Rodent. Eric says, the scientific method, the correct theoretical model is only arrived at by having withstood all counter-arguments. Lenin was right and utterly brilliant, and Eric is correct. Yes, Richard, we are doing a stream on the election. Hang on to your hats. Foma Kuznetsov says, right, I'm going to now try and pronounce something which I'm presuming is written in Russian. So again, all Russian viewers, do forgive me, but I have been trying to read the Cyrillic script, so let's try and give this a go. Foma Kuznetsov v Sovietsky Soyuz Socialista Respublika Mojego Sedcha. I've probably mangled that. Do correct me if I've mangled it. I think my reading of it is getting better, but I'm probably about to be told that I've just said completely the wrong thing. Almir says apparently the Zionist regime is running low on ammunition. Well, I'm sure Genocide Joe's got them covered. Cobra Commander says, I swear you could imagine if Lenin and Trotsky had social media or something. Imagine riding a sick bird, mailing it across land and sea by all manners and get a reply 4 months later from your enemy. Talking of Trotsky and social media, the worst thing you could ever have done to Trotsky is ban him from Twitter. he would have been a natural tweeter, if nothing else. Svetlana says, or asks rather, given that Trotsky the man and Trotskyism are extremely flawed, why is he still seen as a great thinker and hero by so many in the West? In Russia, he's little more than a historical curiosity. Because he was promoted by the imperialists to create I think the Gabriel Rockhill's term is an anti-party left, and that this is the reason why Trotsky has been promoted for 70 plus years now, because it's promoting a man and his ideas who are and have been of usage mainly to the imperialists for 70 years and portraying that as real communism. The reason why he's probably of no interest to anybody in Russia or China or Vietnam or Cuba or any socialist country is because, or even an ex-socialist country, is because his ideas never caught on there. They were promoted by the imperialists here. That's why he's still regarded as something important. And it's still, unfortunately, that's the reason why we need to still discuss him. All right, so I could be mistaken on the Zinoviev quote. Well, Svetlana, I will take your correction and I will recheck my facts on that. Eric says, I wonder if Western Intel hoped Trotsky could be another Mussolini. You might be right about that. Apparently, he did have a meeting with Mussolini's intelligence services. So we will obviously come back to this again in future episodes. But yeah, I think there's all kinds of stories about this, but one was that the Brits were hoping that Trotsky could seize power in the early 1920s. He was, of course, an associate of the British super spy Sidney Riley, who ended up being justifiably executed in the Soviet Union. I think there were people who were invested in the idea of him becoming like a Bonapartist ruler of Russia in that early period. There were other fascist organizations who were fascists who were thinking of using him to sow division in the south of the USSR so they could carry out a successful invasion. Others were prepared to stick him on the throne once they'd got rid of Stalin and have him run a puppet regime, and he might have been willing to do it for them. All this and more were possibilities. Rist Kostadinov says, I've heard that Beria and Malenkov were also opportunists. I've heard very conflicting things about Beria. Malenkov was apparently a ditherer who was sort of neither one thing or the other. But I don't know enough about him to reach a clear judgment. It was in the Khrushchev period that, as you say, Nazi became popular in Hungary and all the mistakes got made that led to what happened in Hungary in 1956. Almir says, Xi and his supporters in the CPC may just save the PRC. Well, we'll see. I mean, the fact that Xi and the new leadership came in after the Hu Jintao period says that the CPC always had more life in it and more ability to resist degeneration and form a new consensus to renew the revolution. We will see how it works out. Foma Kuznetsov says, okay, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Svetlana says, under socialism, Russians would say, let's go to, under socialism, Russians would say, let's go to Peter. Now we say, let's go to Lenin. Perfect example of the perverse Russian soul. That's funny. Rist Kostadinov says, what I find really weird from people who criticize Gorbachev, which he does deserve, in the same breath, say how good it was Deng's reform. I'm actually someone who admires Zhou Enlai the most as statesman. Well, you won't hear that from me. I mean, the difference between Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping, I mean, Deng Xiaoping was a more serious individual. He was more successful than Gorbachev because I think it's because he had to operate on a higher level than Gorbachev. 30 years of Khrushchevite revisionism in the Soviet Union had shut out the working class to a large extent from decision making. In Deng Xiaoping's case, he had to move a lot in a much more cautious fashion because the dictatorship of the proletariat was a very real thing in China in the Cultural Revolution period, for all its drawbacks and failures. And also, the Chinese party was left in a much stronger position by the Cultural Revolution. Had such a thing happened in the Soviet Union, who knows? Maybe it would still be there, even if it was as flawed and as ultimately partially unsuccessful as the Cultural Revolution was in the PRC. Abtin says, I see similarities between Donald Trump and Trotsky. Trump's much funnier. Koba Watts says, did the popularity of Trotsky in Argentina play a part in the rise of Javier Milei? I'll have to come back to you on that one. President Jesus, Norman ex-Maoist Finkelstein. Trotsky was a first-rate intellect. That's my Norman Finkelstein impression. Yeah, I'm not surprised that he says that. I mean, now the man describes himself as a Luxembourgist now. So basically an opportunist twice over. Svetlana says, our views about Beria have been largely shaped by what Khrushchev and co wanted us to think about him. That's true. So yeah, I reserve judgment on Beria because I simply don't know enough about him. I have numerous books by Grover Furr and others which cover this subject to get into. Richard says, bourgeois press apparently can't stop quoting polls projecting a big Labour majority for tomorrow. I still don't think it's going to be as big a majority as they think. If they will get a majority, but I don't think it's going to be 250. If I'm wrong, I'll interrogate it and I will look at why I'm wrong. Right, okay, so we are drawing this to a close for today. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Join us tomorrow from 10:30 p.m. where we will be doing live coverage of the British general election and anything else that comes up. Maybe Genocide Joe will have choked to death on a Twinkie by then. Who knows? But yes, thank you to everybody who's joined us today. The next part of this series will come next week, and that will be on the section of the book entitled The October Revolution and the Tactics of the Russian Communists. So you can find that on the opposition collection. And I will be back with you again tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, where you can find all of the audio versions of these streams. And there'll be a special coming up this weekend on Patreon, where I'm going to be looking at the tail wagging the dog theory with regard to Israel and US imperialism. This has been stimulated by questions from viewers that have been emailed into me. So I'll be doing that as a Patreon stream this Sunday. So thank you to everybody and who's watched and who will watch. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Now I'll throw you back over to a musical outro.